There are two stories running underneath this war that most coverage keeps treating as separate, and they are not separate at all once you actually trace where the weapons, the intelligence, and the money supporting each side are really coming from. The first is that Saudi Arabia, a country that spent months trying hard to stay out of direct combat, has now been dragged into active strikes against Iran's own proxy force in Yemen. The second story is that while Washington keeps pounding Iran night after night, China has quietly kept Iran's entire war machine running through satellites, chemical shipments, and oil purchases that never stopped, even as the bombs kept falling. Put those two threads together and you get a much bigger picture than either headline gives you on its own. Let's start with Saudi Arabia first, because the public trigger for this entire escalation is genuinely dramatic once you understand the full sequence of events leading up to it. According to reporting from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Saudi Arabia struck Sana'a International Airport on July the 13th, specifically to prevent an Iranian plane from landing, a flight that was returning a Houthi delegation home after attending the funeral of Iran's slain supreme leader Ali Khamenei in Tehran. That reporting states the flight itself represented an attempt by Iran and its Yemeni proxy to establish a direct route between Tehran and the Houthi-controlled capital of Sana'a, something that would have openly defied the Saudi-imposed air blockade that's existed specifically to choke off the flow of weapons and support into Houthi-held territory over the years. The internationally recognized government of Yemen claimed responsibility for that strike, though the FDD's own reporting notes that government's genuinely limited military capacity strongly suggests Saudi Arabia actually carried out the operation itself, likely at that government's request. That single strike ended a truce between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis that had held steady for roughly 4 years, according to that same FDD reporting, and the Houthis didn't wait long to respond. According to Bloomberg's coverage from July 14th, the Iran-backed Houthi movement fired ballistic missiles and drones directly at Saudi Arabia, in what that reporting described as the worst attack in several years, an escalation serious enough to threaten pulling the Houthis directly into the broader conflict between Tehran and Washington. The Houthis specifically claimed they targeted Abha Airport in Saudi Arabia's southwestern region and issued a formal direct warning telling all aviation companies to avoid Saudi airspace entirely until what they called a Saudi siege of Sana'a was fully lifted. Saudi state broadcaster Al Ekbariya reported that the kingdom's air defense systems intercepted the incoming Houthi missiles, though it stopped short of confirming whether Riyadh planned any further retaliation at that point. Here's a hook worth sitting with right away before we go any further into the details. A truce that survived 4 years of regional turmoil collapsed over a single funeral flight, which tells you exactly how fragile the underlying peace in that corner of the Gulf actually was the entire time. But here's the detail that most casual coverage of this story completely misses. Because Saudi Arabia's involvement in this war didn't actually start with that airport strike in July. According to Wikipedia's detailed entry on Saudi Arabia's role in the 2026 Iran war, in response to earlier provocations, the Royal Saudi Air Force secretly carried out strikes on Iranian drone and missile launch sites inside Iran itself, and separately struck Iranian-backed militias operating in Iraq. That's a genuinely significant revelation buried inside a Wikipedia footnote. Saudi Arabia wasn't simply a passive bystander absorbing Iranian missile fire this entire war. It was quietly conducting its own offensive strikes against Iranian military infrastructure and Iranian-backed proxy forces well before the public. Dramatic confrontation over that Sana'a airport strike ever made headlines. Think about why Saudi Arabia would choose to keep that kind of direct military action secret for so long, because the answer tells you a lot about the delicate diplomatic tightrope Riyadh has been walking throughout this entire conflict. Saudi Arabia shares a long, exposed coastline and years of hard-won, still fragile normalization, with Iran following their 2023 China-brokered rapprochement. Publicly striking Iranian territory risks unraveling years of careful diplomatic work and inviting exactly the kind of direct retaliation that's now playing out in the open. But privately, Saudi Arabia clearly judged that letting Iranian drone and missile infrastructure operate unchallenged, and letting Iranian-backed militias in Iraq threaten Saudi interests without any consequence, was simply not acceptable either. That's the quiet calculation that's apparently been running underneath the entire public narrative of this war since it began. There's an added layer of irony worth sitting with here too, because it was China itself that brokered that original 2023 normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a diplomatic achievement Beijing publicized heavily at the time as proof of its growing influence across the Middle East. Watching that same Chinese brokered relationship strain to the point of secret Saudi airstrikes against Iranian territory, while China simultaneously keeps arming and funding Iran's broader war effort through satellites and oil purchases, tells you something important about the actual durability of Chinese-mediated diplomacy in this region. A rapprochement built primarily on economic convenience rather than genuine strategic alignment was always going to be fragile the moment a war this large put real pressure on it. And that's exactly what appears to have happened here. Here's a hook worth chewing on. If Saudi Arabia was secretly striking Iranian territory for months while publicly maintaining the posture of a country just trying to protect its own airspace, what does that tell you about how much of this entire regional war has been happening in places the public simply hasn't been shown yet? And the human and material cost of Iran's retaliation against Saudi Arabia has been real and mounting since the very start of this conflict. According to Wikipedia's dedicated entry on the 2026 Iranian strikes on Saudi Arabia, locations across the kingdom have been subject to multiple retaliatory Iranian missile strikes since the war began on February 28th, with strikes specifically targeting oil refineries inside Saudi territory. That same entry documents Saudi Arabia intercepting 2 hostile drones aimed at the massive Ras Tanura oil refinery, though a limited fire still broke out from falling shrapnel, forcing a brief closure of the facility before it reopened on March 13th. The United States Embassy in Riyadh was also struck by 2 separate Iranian drones, according to that Wikipedia entry, causing what Saudi authorities described as limited fire and minor material damage. An attack that came shortly before the IRGC publicly declared its intention to begin destroying what it called American political centers across the region, explicitly naming the Riyadh embassy among its targets. The Ras Tanura Aramco facility was later struck for a second time by a separate projectile. Tallied casualties from that same entry list: 2 Saudi civilians killed and 12 injured, alongside 2 American service members killed, 29 wounded, and 2 U.S. aircraft destroyed with 5 more damaged, all connected to the broader Iranian campaign against targets inside Saudi Arabia specifically. Let's sit with those casualty figures for a moment, because they tell you Saudi Arabia has already been paying a real human price in this war for months, well before the dramatic Sana'a airport strike ever made international headlines. 2 civilians killed, 29 American service members wounded on Saudi soil, multiple aircraft destroyed. That's not a country standing safely on the sidelines of someone else's fight. That's a country that's already been absorbing direct Iranian retaliation for months, which makes the eventual decision to strike back openly against the Houthis feel less like a sudden escalation and more like the public unveiling of a fight that had already been quietly underway. Let's talk about the strategic logic behind Iran specifically targeting the Ras Tanura refinery twice in particular, because it's not a random or arbitrary choice of target at all. Ras Tanura is one of the largest crude oil export terminals in the entire world, a facility so central to Saudi Arabia's oil economy that even a brief closure ripples through global energy markets within hours. Striking it once could plausibly be dismissed as a warning shot. Striking it a second time tells you Iran views that specific facility as a legitimate, repeatable target rather than a one-time message, which mirrors almost exactly the same economic choke point logic we've seen play out against Karg Island and the broader Strait of Hormuz corridor throughout this entire war. Whether it's an Iranian facility under American bombardment or a Saudi facility under Iranian missile fire, the underlying strategic principle across this entire conflict keeps repeating itself. Hit the economic engine, not just the military hardware, because that's where the actual leverage in a modern war like this one tends to live. And the attack on the American embassy in Riyadh deserves its own moment of attention too, because embassies carry a different kind of symbolic weight than a refinery or a military installation. Striking a diplomatic compound is widely treated under international norms as one of the most serious escalatory acts a state or its proxies can take short of a direct attack on another country's home soil. The fact that the IRGC followed that embassy strike by publicly declaring its intent to destroy what it called American political centers across the region tells you this wasn't an isolated incident either. It was framed by Tehran itself as the opening move in a broader campaign against American diplomatic and political presence throughout the Gulf, not just its military footprint. Now let's fast forward to where things stand this week, because the Houthi front has kept expanding fast. According to CNBC's reporting from July 23rd, Yemen's Houthis claimed they had targeted 2 Saudi oil tankers named the Encilia and the Layla, with drones and missiles, alleging the vessels had violated a maritime blockade the group had separately announced against Saudi Arabia. That same CNBC reporting notes this would mark the first confirmed attack since the Houthis declared that naval blockade, and it came the same night CENTCOM announced it had completed a 12th consecutive round of strikes against Iran. President Trump, speaking at Wheeler High School in Marietta, Georgia on July 22nd, according to that same CNBC report, said the United States would hold Iran directly responsible for any future Houthi attacks, a direct escalation of the stakes for Tehran, given that the Houthis are technically a separate organization operating hundreds of miles away in Yemen. The Institute for the Study of War, cited in that CNBC reporting, said in its latest assessment that at least 7 commercial vessels had already changed course, specifically to avoid transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait because of the Houthi blockade on Saudi ports. That strait is the choke point connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, and from there to global shipping markets. The same ISW assessment noted the United States had also increasingly begun striking Iranian targets in western and northwestern Iran, expanding well beyond the southern coastal targets that dominated the earlier months of this campaign. Here's a hook worth holding on to. When President Trump says Washington will hold Iran responsible for what a separate militia in a separate country does, that's not really a statement about the Houthis at all. That's a statement about exactly how much control the United States believes Tehran still holds over its regional proxy network, whether that proxy pulls the trigger itself or not. Think about the practical consequences of that Bab el-Mandeb rerouting for a moment, because it's not just an abstract shipping statistic. Every vessel that changes course to avoid that strait adds real time and real fuel cost to its voyage, exactly the same kind of economic drag we've already seen play out around the Strait of Hormuz throughout this entire war. The Bab el-Mandeb sits at the southern gateway into the Red Sea, feeding directly into the Suez Canal, which means a sustained Houthi blockade. That doesn't just threaten Saudi shipping specifically, it threatens the broader flow of goods between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe more generally. 7 vessels rerouting might sound like a modest number on its own, but it's an early indicator of a pattern that, if it continues escalating the way the Hormuz situation has, could eventually force the same kind of industry-wide rerouting and insurance repricing we've already documented happening around the Strait of Hormuz in recent months. That overlap matters enormously for understanding the full shape of this war right now. It's no longer just one contested waterway squeezing global energy trade. It's potentially becoming 2, simultaneously, on opposite sides of the Arabian Peninsula, both connected back to the exact same underlying conflict between Iran and the coalition of countries now actively opposing it. And there's a genuinely alarming new detail here that connects directly back to Iran's own hand in this specific escalation, one that moves this story well beyond simple financial or diplomatic backing and into something closer to direct operational involvement on the ground. According to reporting from Breitbart, published within the last day, Iran's IRGC reportedly flew personnel directly into Yemen specifically to help the Houthis block shipping traffic. That same reporting traces the broader collapse of the Saudi-Houthi truce back to the Houthi invasion of Sana'a and the resulting civil war going back to 2014, when Saudi Arabia first became involved on behalf of Yemen's internationally recognized government, and notes that a 4-year truce had largely held direct hostilities in check since 2022, right up until this month's collapse. That same Breitbart reporting also details that in early July, before any of this reached international headlines, the Houthis had already launched an attack on Yemeni government positions in the Hodeidah Governorate, killing 16 government-aligned fighters in some of the deadliest internal fighting Yemen had seen in years, entirely separate from anything involving Saudi Arabia or Iran directly. Think about what it means for Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel to be physically present in Yemen coordinating a shipping blockade against Saudi Arabia, rather than simply providing weapons and funding from a distance the way Tehran has typically operated with the Houthis for years. That's a meaningful escalation in the level of direct Iranian involvement, moving from arming and financing a proxy force towards something closer to direct operational coordination on the ground. If accurate, that reporting suggests Tehran isn't just tolerating Houthi escalation against Saudi Arabia as a useful side effect of the broader war. It's actively helping engineer it. Let's pivot now to the second major thread running underneath this entire conflict. Because while Saudi Arabia has been quietly fighting its own fight against Iran and its proxies, China has been running an entirely different kind of support operation for Tehran, one that never involves a single Chinese soldier setting foot anywhere in the region. According to a detailed analysis published by Small Wars Journal, a growing body of evidence indicates China has significantly contributed intelligence support, satellite navigation, radar systems, and electronic warfare technologies that have measurably improved Iran's targeting capabilities throughout this war. That same analysis notes that Iran's ability to execute accurate missile and drone strikes against Israeli urban centers and American military installations across the Gulf genuinely astonished military analysts, and that despite 3 decades of Iran developing its own indigenous missile program, critics increasingly argue that this level of operational precision cannot be explained purely by domestic Iranian technology alone. Here's a hook worth chewing on. If Iran's missiles are suddenly landing with a level of precision nobody expected from a domestically built arsenal, the question worth asking isn't just how Iran got better, it's who's been quietly helping them aim. And the evidence for exactly that kind of help is remarkably specific once you dig into it. According to reporting from The Diplomat, the Financial Times reported on April 15th that China had provided Iran with a commercial reconnaissance satellite, giving Tehran precise targeting information used to strike American military facilities across the Middle East. That same reporting names the Chinese company involved directly, Earth-I Co., which reportedly built and launched a satellite designated TE-01B, and provided what's called in-orbit delivery service to Iran. A separate Chinese company, Empasat, also reportedly supplied Iran with satellite data and control services. And a third Chinese firm, a geospatial artificial intelligence company called Mizar Vision, reportedly published satellite imagery, specifically tagged with location data covering multiple American military facilities, both before and during the war itself. That same diplomat reporting notes that CNN separately reported on April 12th that China was providing Iran with new air defense systems expected to arrive within weeks of that report. Let's sit with the specificity of those company names for a moment, because this isn't vague, unattributed rumor. These are named Chinese commercial entities, providing named satellite systems, tagged with location data specifically covering American military installations, during an active shooting war between the United States and Iran. That's a level of documented technical cooperation that goes well beyond quiet diplomatic sympathy or simple economic trade. Think about how this kind of commercial satellite arrangement actually functions in practice, because it's a genuinely clever way for a government to provide military-grade intelligence support while maintaining plausible deniability at the state level. Earth-I Co. and Imposat are structured as commercial companies, selling satellite imagery and data services, the same basic business model as any private geospatial firm anywhere in the world. That structure gives the Chinese government a convenient buffer. If challenged directly, Beijing can point to these as private commercial transactions, rather than official state-to-state military assistance, even though the practical effect, precise targeting data flowing to a country actively fighting the United States, is functionally identical to a direct government-to-government intelligence sharing arrangement. That's exactly the kind of gray zone activity modern great power competition increasingly runs on, official denial paired with unofficial, thoroughly documented enablement. And it's worth understanding why commercial reconnaissance satellites specifically matter so much for a country like Iran in the middle of an active war. Iran's own indigenous satellite program, while it has made real progress over the past decade, still lags well behind the resolution, coverage frequency, and processing sophistication that commercial providers like the ones named in this reporting can offer. A satellite specifically designed and launched to provide precise imagery, paired with a company actively tagging that imagery with the exact locations of American military facilities, closes a capability gap that Iran's own space program likely could not have closed on its own within the time frame this war has actually played out over. That's the practical value of this kind of foreign support. It's not simply convenient. For Iran, it may well be the difference between guesswork and precision when targeting American assets across an entire region. There's also a chemical dimension to this cooperation that deserves its own moment of attention, because it connects directly to Iran's ability to keep manufacturing the exact missiles causing so much of this damage across the Gulf. According to reporting from the IP Defense Forum publication in early March, China allowed 2 ships owned by an Iranian company already sanctioned by the United States for supplying Tehran's ballistic missile program to depart from a chemical storage port along China's southeastern coast. That same reporting, citing the Washington Post, states the vessels were likely carrying sodium perchlorate, a key chemical precursor used in solid rocket fuel production. And a separate, earlier Wall Street Journal report cited in that same coverage found that 2 Iranian ships had previously been loaded with approximately 1,000 tons of that exact chemical, enough, according to that reporting, to produce roughly 260 mid-range Iranian missiles. Here's a hook worth carrying forward. 1,000 tons of a single chemical precursor sounds abstract until you convert it into missiles. And 260 missiles is not a stockpile a country accumulates by accident. That's a deliberate, sustained supply chain. And it was running directly through a Chinese port while American forces were actively engaged in combat with the country receiving that shipment. And this kind of technical and material support hasn't been a one-time event either. According to reporting from Fox News, citing an assessment from the Institute for the Study of War, China has been providing military assistance specifically aimed at helping Iran reconstitute its missile program, even as American and Israeli forces work to systematically degrade it through this ongoing bombing campaign. The Institute's own language, quoted directly in that reporting, states that China is helping Iran reconstitute the Iranian missile program amid U.S.-Israeli efforts to degrade it. That's about as direct a description of a rebuild while you bomb dynamic as you're likely to find in any single piece of open-source military analysis covering this war. Let's talk about the economic dimension underpinning all of this technical support, because it's arguably even more significant than any single satellite or chemical shipment, and it's the piece that actually keeps Iran's entire war machine funded month after month. According to reporting from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, China purchases roughly 95% of Iran's total oil exports, much of it sold at a steep discount because of the sanctions risk involved, saving Beijing an estimated $4 billion annually in the process. That same reporting notes China has remained Iran's largest oil customer for 6 consecutive years running, and that Beijing actually bought a record-high volume of Iranian crude during Tehran's earlier 12-day clash with Israel and the United States back in June of 2025. Remarkably, the same FDD analysis states China has continued importing Iranian oil even throughout this current war, with crude moving through tankers parked across Southeast Asia, where it gets transferred ship to ship near Indonesia and Malaysia, before eventually reaching what the industry calls Chinese teapot refineries, smaller independent Chinese refining operations that process discounted, sanctioned crude that larger state-owned Chinese refiners typically avoid touching directly. Think about what that oil relationship actually means for Iran's ability to keep fighting this war at all. Every barrel of oil Iran manages to sell, even at a steep sanctions-driven discount, is revenue that funds missile production, funds the IRGC's regional proxy network, and funds the exact kind of continued resistance that's kept this war grinding on for months rather than ending quickly under pure American and Israeli pressure. China isn't just providing satellites and chemical precursors, it's providing the actual financial oxygen, keeping Iran's broader war economy functioning, purchase by purchase, tanker by tanker, even as the rest of the world watches American bombs fall on Iranian territory night after night. Consider the logistics involved in that ship-to-ship transfer process near Indonesia and Malaysia for a moment, because it's a genuinely elaborate operation built specifically to obscure the true origin of the oil by the time it reaches a Chinese refinery. Tankers carrying sanctioned Iranian crude effectively go dark for a period, transferring their cargo to a second vessel in international waters far from either Iran or China, before that second tanker continues onto a Chinese port with a cleaner paper trail than the oil's actual point of origin would otherwise show. That's not the kind of infrastructure that gets built overnight in response to a single war. It's a mature, well-established sanctions evasion supply chain that's clearly been refined over years of practice, one that simply kept running without interruption once this current conflict began, precisely because it was never designed to be vulnerable to a single war's disruption in the first place. Here's a hook worth sitting with. A country doesn't need to send a single soldier to a war zone to become one of the most important players in that war, and China's entire approach to this conflict is proof of exactly that principle in action. And yet, publicly, China has maintained a posture of careful diplomatic distance from all of this. According to Wikipedia's dedicated entry on China's involvement in the 2026 Iran war, Beijing has focused its public messaging on diplomatic mediation, even as Chinese companies have simultaneously provided Iran with dual-use technology, including missile parts and geospatial intelligence. That same entry cites the broadcaster Jassim al-Azawi, describing these contributions as enabling Iran to sustain its own defenses without needing to escalate the conflict into a broader confrontation directly involving Moscow or Beijing themselves. The United States has responded by levying sanctions against specific Chinese companies for processing Iranian crude oil and for allegedly providing the exact satellite data used to help Iran target American and allied forces across the region. And despite publicly condemning the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran, China has notably not committed any troops or engaged in direct combat operations of its own. That same Wikipedia entry notes China abstained rather than voted against United Nations Security Council Resolution 2817, which specifically condemned Iranian attacks on Gulf states. A deliberate diplomatic choice that avoided directly siding with Tehran on paper while still declining to formally condemn Iran's own attacks on its neighbors. That abstention is worth sitting with for a second, because it's a perfect microcosm of China's entire approach to this war, never quite endorsing Iran's actions loudly enough to draw direct international blame, but never quite condemning them either, all while Chinese companies keep the satellites running, the chemical shipments flowing, and the oil tankers moving. That's not neutrality. That's a very carefully calibrated form of enabling, structured specifically to survive scrutiny at the United Nations, while still delivering exactly the material support Iran needs to keep this war going. Let's put these two threads together now, because I think that's where the real strategic picture of this entire war actually comes into focus, once both sides of it are laid out side by side, rather than treated as two unrelated headlines. On one side, you have Saudi Arabia, a country geographically trapped in the middle of this conflict, forced to abandon years of careful, patient normalization with Iran, and openly confront Iran's most active regional proxy, after quietly fighting a shadow war against Iranian infrastructure for months already. On the other side, you have China, a country with no direct border, no historical rivalry, and no immediate physical exposure to this war, choosing instead to quietly sustain Iran's entire capacity to keep fighting through satellites, chemical precursors, air defense technology, and steady oil purchases, all while maintaining just enough diplomatic distance to avoid becoming an official combatant on paper. Those two dynamics aren't unrelated. Every missile that lands more accurately because of Chinese satellite targeting data is a missile Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan now have to defend against with greater urgency. Every ton of Chinese sodium perchlorate that reaches Iranian ports is raw material for missiles that eventually get fired at exactly the Gulf states, now being forced into direct confrontation with Iran's proxies. And every barrel of discounted Iranian oil that China keeps buying is revenue that funds the very IRGC network now reportedly coordinating a Houthi blockade against Saudi shipping. Saudi Arabia's shadow war against Iran and China's shadow support for Iran are two sides of exactly the same coin, playing out on opposite ends of the same underlying conflict. There's a broader lesson in international relations sitting underneath this entire comparison too, one that extends well past this single war. Great powers rarely need to deploy their own soldiers to shape the outcome of a regional conflict anymore. China has managed to become one of the most consequential external actors in this entire war without a single Chinese uniform ever appearing on a Gulf battlefield, purely through satellites, chemical shipments, and steady oil purchases routed through a well-practiced sanctions evasion network. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, a country with every reason to want to stay out of this fight entirely given its fragile normalization with Iran, has been pulled deeper and deeper into direct confrontation anyway, first secretly, now openly, simply because geography and proxy warfare left it with no realistic way to remain a bystander. Those two very different paths into the same war, one chosen deliberately from a position of remove, the other forced by proximity and circumstance, may end up telling us more about how modern regional wars actually get shaped by outside forces than anything happening on the front lines themselves. What do you think this means for how this war actually gets resolved? If Saudi Arabia keeps getting pulled deeper into direct confrontation with Iran's proxies, while China keeps quietly resupplying Iran's ability to fight, do you think this stays contained to the current set of players? Or do you think it eventually forces a wider reckoning involving Beijing directly? Let me know where you land on this, because based on everything covered here, both of these threads have been escalating steadily for months, not staying static, and neither one shows any sign of reversing course anytime soon given the pace of events over just the last few weeks alone. One final thought before wrapping this up. Wars that look like a straightforward fight between two countries almost never actually are, once you look closely enough at who's actually supplying the weapons, the intelligence, and the money keeping each side able to keep fighting. This conflict looks, on the surface, like a fight between the United States and Iran, but Saudi Arabia has already been secretly fighting its own fight against Iranian infrastructure for months. It's now openly at war with Iran's Houthi proxy. And China has been quietly functioning as Iran's supply line this entire time without ever officially entering the conflict at all. Keep watching both of those threads closely, because based on everything traced here, they may end up mattering just as much to how this war eventually ends as anything happening directly between Washington and Tehran. And neither one is likely to stay out of the headlines for very long, given how quickly both have already escalated over just the past few months. Sources used for verification, reference only, not part of the voiceover, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Riyadh strikes Houthi-controlled airport to block flight from Iran, July 15, 2026. July 13th, Sana'a airport strike, truce collapse, Hodeidah fighting detail. Bloomberg, Iran-backed Houthis strike Saudi Arabia in major escalation, July 14, 2026. Abha airport attack, Saudi interception statement, rig zone. Houthis strike Saudi Arabia in major escalation, July 14, 2026. Corroborating detail on Abha strike and aviation warning CNBC. Iran war. Houthis claim strikes on 2 Saudi oil tankers in Red Sea, July 23, 2026. And Celia, Layla. Tanker strikes, Trump's Wheeler. High school statement, CENTCOM 12th night of strikes. ISW Bab El Mandeb rerouting assessment. Breitbart, report. Iran's terrorist IRGC flew into Yemen to help Houthis block shipping, July 24, 2026. IRGC personnel in Yemen. Sana'a civil war background. Early July, Hodeidah attack Wikipedia. Saudi Arabia in the 2026 Iran war. RSAF secret strikes on Iranian sites and Iraq militias. Riyadh explosions. Embassy attack Wikipedia. 2026, Iranian strikes on Saudi Arabia. Ras Tanura refinery strikes. Casualty, damage tally. Small Wars Journal. China-Iran intelligence cooperation in the 2026 war. March 20th, 2026. Satellite navigation, radar, electronic warfare support assessment. IP Defense Forum. China's support to Iran's weapons program contributes to civilian deaths. April 3rd, 2026. Sodium perchlorate shipment, WSJ 1,000-ton 260 missile figure. The Diplomat, helping Iran. China is a party in the war. April 24th, 2026. TE 01B satellite, Earth-I Co, Empasat, Mazar Vision, CNN Air Defense Systems report, Wikipedia, China and the 2026 Iran war, diplomatic mediation posture, sanctions on Chinese companies, UNSC resolution 2817 abstention. Fox News, China helping Iran rebuild missile program according to recent reports. April 7th, 2026. ISW Missile Reconstitution Assessment Foundation for Defense of Democracies, 5 things to know about China's wartime support for Iran. April 30th, 2026. 95% oil purchase figure, $4 billion savings estimate, Teapot Refinery or ship-to-ship transfer detail. Please verify current developments before publishing, as several claims here, particularly IRGC personnel movements in Yemen and specific Chinese satellite company involvement, rest on single-source reporting and assessments from think tanks rather than officially confirmed government statements.